Hello. Am I audible?
Yeah, hi Biswajit, I can hear you.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible to me.
Okay, okay. So, Gunaratna ma'am, good afternoon. Professor Gunaratne, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
Ma'am, hello. Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes, I can hear you. Thanks.
Okay, okay.
I'm on at 4 o'clock, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So, we will start today's session within 3 minutes. And ma'am, would you like to share your screen?
Okay. Do you want me to go now or do I go at 4 o'clock?
No, no. Right now, this is your time.
Okay.
And after that, Dr. Chatterjee will deliver his lecture. And if you want to, yeah. Oh, okay.
Okay.
So thank you, Dr. Camera, Professor Camera Gunaratne. She is the professor of Open University of Sri Lanka in the International Faculty Development Program.
Okay. Can I start?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So I would like to thank you for inviting me to speak at this workshop. And so I'm talking on the issue of environmental policy, ethics, and planning. And I've been following some of the other presentations yesterday and the day after. So in this short time, I thought I would just raise a few issues. Okay. So let's look at environmental ethics first. And these are a couple of definitions that I got from other writers. Environmental ethics is the study of ethical questions raised by human relationships with the non-human environment. Environmental ethics is a branch of ethics that studies the relation of human beings and the environment and how ethics plays a role in this. So, environmental ethics is a branch of philosophy, and it's all about how we relate to the environment. And it emerged as a field of study in the 1970s. And as you know, at that time, there came a growing awareness of the human impacts of on the natural environment. And there were certain catalysts for this. For example, the book called Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, in which she detailed the horrendous effects of chemicals and polluting substances on the environment and the destruction of non-human and human life, the negative impacts. But environmental ethics is obviously not a new concept. And the question of human interaction with the non-human environment and non-human living creatures has been part, particularly in our part of the world, in South Asia and in other communities and countries. We have also based it on our religious and spiritual beliefs, our philosophies, in our traditional communities. So I think we do have a traditional ethical system and a value-based system about how we relate to the environment. When we go on to the issue of values, the values of the non-human environment to us humans is central to the discourse on ethics. And these values have been categorized as, do we see the non-human environment as having purely an instrumental value for us? Or do we also see it as having an intrinsic value for us? And let me just talk a little bit about these two value systems. Now, instrumental values basically means we value something as being useful for some reason or for some other purpose. And where the natural environment is concerned, usually the purpose is to benefit humans. So instrumental values, the instrumental values of the natural environment to us could be cultural, recreational, medicinal, plants, and so on, the medicinal value of genetic resources and plants. It could have spiritual value for us. It could have transformational value for us. How do we transform the environment to benefit us even further? It has its own natural resource value. We have ecosystem services values. So we value natural resources, non-human living creatures, and the non-human environment as in some way essential to benefit us and make our life better. Even cultural and spiritual values are in some sense also instrumental. And it depends on humans to decide what these values are and whether the values are very high or whether they are low or whether something we consider it to have no value at all. Economic values are probably the most important aspect of the instrumental values of natural resources. And we tend to think of natural resources purely from an economic perspective. And for example, the market value of something. And it is that market value that is causing a lot of the destruction of natural resources. For example, deforestation. We deforest for plantations to convert forests into agriculture. There's a huge issue in Indonesia and Malaysia on deforestation for palm oil. We fill up wetlands because we see these ecosystems, these forests and these wetlands, for example, as in some way having to be converted by us, either for building purposes, for construction, for agriculture, and we do not see their value as forests and as wetlands. But very often, even from an economic point of view, the value of leaving these resources the way they are is often greater than conversion. For example, the city where I live, Colombo, there has been a lot of filling of wetlands, marshes around Colombo. And in recent years, this has caused massive flooding. And the cost of those floods is far greater than the economic value of converting those wetlands for some other purpose. So if the economic assessment had been done, it would have been found that actually the wetlands have more marketable and economic value as wetlands rather than as being filled up for construction purposes, which is usually the reason why they are being filled up. If you look at cultural and spiritual values, I think this goes back again to our part of the world, our traditional communities, maybe the way we viewed the environment several centuries ago, where people looked at the environment as part of themselves and as themselves as part of the environment and not as two distinct entities. And maybe we have lost that value to a great extent. But it does prevail, I think, still in many traditional communities. And for example, Ramachandra Guha and Madhav Gadgil talk about the sacred groves of India, where they say the acreage of these sacred groves are actually greater than the acreage of protected areas, modern protected areas. So these are the kind of examples, the way we view wildlife, the way we view wild creatures. These cultural and spiritual values still do prevail to a great extent, though perhaps we are losing those values. And in the same way, Darrell Posey, in his book, Cultural and Spiritual Values of Biodiversity, says that indigenous people don't really accept principles, these concepts of biodiversity and conservation, because they don't see biodiversity and nature as something to be conserved. They just see it as a part of themselves. Similarly, the World Charter for Nature also acknowledges the intrinsic value of biodiversity. And the major religions in our part of the world also have this strong environmental ethic, the value for life, the value that non-human life is as important as human life. And it is equally wrong to take non-human life as it is to take human life. Many of our religions teach us that. So, intrinsic value does not look at the possible benefits of the entity to anyone or anything else. It is the value that the entity has of itself and in itself. But the question is, do we recognize that value in anything other than in human beings? We all agree that human beings have intrinsic value, and that is where the fundamental principles of human rights is based, that every person has an intrinsic value and they are born with certain rights which cannot be violated. But the question again is whether we recognize the intrinsic value of non-human creatures and the environment, and these are the ongoing debates. There are some examples of international laws, conventions, and national laws which do recognize the intrinsic value of non-human creatures and of the natural environment. If you take the Whaling Convention, whales have been hunted for 150, 200 years till they're almost extinct. And the Whaling Convention finally recognized that humans were hunting whales to extinction. So the convention was brought in to protect them and stop this hunting. They were hunted for human uses, for human purposes. So I think we can say that the Whaling Convention does recognize the intrinsic value of whales, that these are creatures that have the same rights to survive, to breed, to live as we do, irrespective of whether they are useful to us or not, irrespective of whether we can get some benefit from them or not. Similarly, there are two very interesting examples of two South American countries which are legally recognizing the rights of nature. And Bolivia has a law called the Rights of Mother Earth, in which they say that nature has the same rights as humans to be valued, to be preserved, to be conserved, not to be harmed. Similarly, the Constitution of Ecuador has a chapter on rights of nature. There was a recent case in New Zealand which recognized that a river has certain rights, and a river also needs to be protected, not because of its usefulness to humans, but because it has this right in itself. So even laws and judgments are beginning to recognize the intrinsic value of the non-natural environment. Now, there are other philosophies also that look at this relationship between humans and the environment. And one is the deep ecology movement, which is very much a Western-based philosophy. But that again recognizes the inherent value of all living beings and says that environmental policies have to be based on this value. It believes that humans have no right to interfere with the non-human world, and we must do so only to satisfy our basic needs and not unnecessarily exploit the non-human world. Another interesting philosophy is that of ecofeminism, which grew out of the feminist movement and feminist theory. And that compares the oppression of women to the exploitation of nature. And that looks at the way in which a patriarchal or male-dominated society treats women and treats nature, and oppresses and exploits both. And you have people like Vandana Shiva, very famous for the work they are doing. I'm sure you have listened to some of her talks. And what they say is also not only the oppression of women by exploitation of nature, the developmental impacts on women, which are very different to the developmental impacts on men. And studies have shown that women are differently affected by development projects and often to their detriment. It also looks at the impact of environmental degradation on women. Now, the IPCC report has very clearly said that women will be more impacted by climate change than men will be. So it's this all part of a feminist environmental theory, the study of ecofeminism. Then we look at anthropocentrism, which is human-centeredness. And there again, which believes that only humans have intrinsic value. The humans are at the center of the earth and our natural environment, and all the rest of nature has simply been created to sustain and support human life. And now we are in the middle of what is called the Anthropocene. Human impacts on the environment are becoming, even worse and worse and having very detrimental impacts. Now, many issues have both instrumental and intrinsic factors, and I talked earlier about wetlands, because this issue of wetlands has become very central to Sri Lanka, also deforestation. So wetlands do have instrumental values for us as wetlands. They are good for flood control, for purifying water. They are ecosystems. They provide sustenance for bird life. They are for tourism and recreation. So wetlands in themselves do have instrumental values for us. But they also, sometimes people see them as being more valuable, more economically valuable if they are converted. And as I said earlier, that is also now debatable. If you look at it in plain rupees and cents, does it make more sense to convert a wetland and suffer with flooding, or keep wetlands as it is as a protection against floods if you calculate the economic costs, which I don't think economists, at least in Sri Lanka, are doing. And now we have a serious problem of policies that are converting forest, wetlands, and other ecosystems, and looking only at the instrumental value and completely disregarding the intrinsic value of these ecosystems. So based on these points, let's look at climate change, human-induced climate change. So who is affected by climate change? And where does this concept of climate justice, the injustice of climate change, come in? The ethics and the values of how we are going to deal with climate change. So who is affected? The environment, the natural environment is seriously affected. Non-human living creatures are affected. Less developed countries like ours will be more affected than the richer countries who are actually contributing more to climate change. In addition to that, even within our countries, the poor and vulnerable populations will be more affected than those who are richer and economically more powerful. Non-human life is being affected, and future generations are also being affected. So the question of how we deal with climate change will also be affected, will also be influenced by our ethics and values. So what is the importance of ethical issues? Now, if we are looking at environmental planning and environmental policies, well, obviously it will be based on our worldview, on our opinions and ideas of how we should deal with the environment. And when we formulate policies, we have to decide, do we go purely for instrumental value because we want development, or do we look at the intrinsic value? Do we try to balance both? Do we recognize that even with the intrinsic value, there will be an instrumental value as well? What factors should we keep in mind when formulating environmental policies, and should these ethical issues play a role? And whose interest should we consider? Only the interests of development, or the interests of the environment, the natural environment, the interests of non-human living creatures, the interests of the poor and the vulnerable in our countries, the interests of future generations. So our planning and policy, I think, will be based on our ethical worldview of how we view the environment and how we view our relationship with it, and how we decide how we are going to live within this environment. So, well, policy in a sense starts with one's constitution. Because I mentioned the Ecuadorian constitution and the Bolivian law of Mother Earth. Now most constitutions in the world today do have a provision on the environment. But here again, very often that provision is also very human-centered, because it gives people a human right to a healthy environment. And there again, it is looking at it from the human point of view. It is saying that all humans have the right to a healthy environment, but it does not talk about non-human living creatures. And it also does not factor into account that the natural environment should also be preserved and protected irrespective of the human right. So even the human right is in a sense human-centered, it's anthropocentric, right? So constitutional provisions will set the tone for how a country intends to interact with the natural environment. And this is now, the Sri Lanka constitution doesn't have a human right to the environment. But we have a provision in our directive principles of state policy, which is non-enforceable in courts. And it says the state shall protect, preserve, and improve the environment for the benefit of the community. But there again, from the wording, you can see again, this is human-centered. Now, the Constitution of Afghanistan is a little different because it says the state shall be obligated to adopt necessary measures to protect and improve forests as well as the living environment. Now, here it doesn't mention that it should be only for the benefit of the people. Here, the wording is very different to our Constitution, and it seems to imply that it should be done anyway, that the forests and the living environment need to be protected, and it is keeping the human interests out of that clause. So I found that very interesting. But the Sri Lankan constitution does not have an enforceable right to a healthy environment. Now, if we look at the types of policies that we use for environmental protection. Now in Sri Lankan laws, it's predominantly a command and control system where we set out what you can do for the environment, what you can do and what you cannot do. And there are penalties if you violate those provisions. So these are, a lot of our laws are very old laws, and this command and control system of policy making and legal frameworks is also now being questioned as to whether this kind of system alone can really achieve the purpose. And now very often, particularly in areas like ecosystems, like forest management, wildlife management, there is a new discourse on public participation in environmental management. Now, our laws on forests and wildlife parks are very command and control. So it's basically you cannot go into a park without a permit. When you're in the park, there are certain things you cannot do. There are penalties if you do them. But this completely leaves out the local people, and it does not give them a stake in conservation. Even though traditionally, the people went into the forest, they looked after the forest because they knew they depended on the forest. But after colonization, this kind of law was brought in. And now there's a kind of a disconnect between the people and the forest. It's the same with fisheries. And some of these laws, they're trying to now adapt them and amend them to change the tone from command and control to more community participation, public involvement in environmental management. Then you have market-based instruments. These are sort of mostly used for pollution purposes and so on. Taxes and charges, subsidies, payments for environmental services. These are not widely used in Sri Lanka. We haven't quite reached that level of sophistication, I think. And we are a very small country. We are not heavily industrialized. So we don't have much of these market-based instruments. But many other countries are amending their laws and policies to be based on this kind of strategy. So since I'm from Sri Lanka, I'll just show you some of the environmental policies in Sri Lanka. And as you can see, some of these have not been updated for very long. The most recent one is the climate change policy. We had a national environmental policy in 2003. It's very much out of date. We had a national conservation strategy, the environmental action plan, the climate change policy, which is most recent. We have the forestry sector master plan, the coastal zone management plan. And we have other things like the human-elephant conflict, the plan for that, the policy on that. So we have a range of policies. And all these policies usually have an introductory section which sets out the ethical foundations of these policies, the value base on which these policies have been formulated, and what we hope to achieve. So this is where the ethics and the values will be the foundation of our policies. So policies obviously have to be enforced by the related laws. So we have your umbrella law, as is the National Environmental Act of 1988. It has been amended a couple of times. Then we have a range of sectoral laws. We have the Coast Conservation Act, the Forest Ordinance, which is very old in British times. And the Forest Ordinance actually brought in a command and control system which had not traditionally prevailed. Similarly, with the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, again during British times, which set up these protected areas and kept the local village people out of those areas. Then more recently, we have the Marine Pollution Prevention Act, the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Act. This act is trying to bring in a more community participation, bringing the fisheries communities in to try and have consultative decision-making on fisheries. And we have another called the National Heritage Wilderness Areas Act. Then, of course, you have environmental impact assessment, which again, we all know what that is. And that again is founded on certain policies. If you want development, and the development is going to impact on the natural environment, then the decision has to be made. Which are we going to give priority to? Are we going to look at the natural environment purely as instrumental and go ahead? Are we going to recognize its intrinsic value, the fact that it has to be kept like that? Now, many of our development policies are aggravating the human-elephant conflict. Recently, there was a talk by elephant experts who have predicted that by 2050, we might not have elephants in Sri Lanka at the rate that they are being killed. So do we look at these animals for their intrinsic value or their instrumental value? And they do have an instrumental value because they are a big tourist attraction, which also brings in money. But we might be destroying that as well for other reasons. So these are the decisions that we need to take, and this will be founded on our ethics and our value base. Then you have the enforcement of laws, and you have the institutions to enforce the laws. So you have your government ministries, departments, and so on. You have the courts and the judiciary, and very often it's the courts and the judiciary that are laying down these values in judgments. And then these values often have the force of law. So even where you don't have laws passed by parliament, the judiciary can also lay down a value base and an ethics base. And then you have various tribunals also to take decisions. So you have your policies, you have the laws to back them up, and then you have the enforcement of laws. So I'll just stop there and we can take questions. Thank you. මොකක්ද කරන්නේ? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Hold on, just a minute. I can't hear you.
No, he's mute. He has muted his mic.
Professor Chowdhury, you have muted your mic. Okay.
No, still my muted.
Let me check. Okay.
No, he has muted. Ask him to unmute.
Professor Chowdhury, okay.
Am I audible?
Yeah, now you're audible. Okay, great.
Okay. So basically, thank you for sharing your wonderful lecture on the very important issues that environmental policy planning and all that. And I'm very thankful that you accept our invitation and deliver your valuable speech here. So one more thing, right now the platform is for the audience. I would like to request all the participants, if you have any queries to our Honorable Professor Gunaratne ma'am, you may ask directly to her. So any audience have any question, please ask. Yes, Mr. Dr. Bharti PK. I saw.
Okay. Can you say the influence of Buddhism?
Dr. Bharti, have you any queries?
Yeah. I'm sorry, my volume seems to be a little low. Hold on.
Hello?
Ma'am, can you say the influence of Buddhism and other religions?
Hello?
I can't hear you.
Ma'am?
Yeah. Okay, carry on.
Can you say the influence of Buddhism and other religious movements in the environmental protection movements in Sri Lanka?
Well, yeah, actually, Buddhism plays a very big role in Sri Lanka. As you know, it's the major religion. And I think in very early times, it really influenced because there are records of the kings. They say the first protected area was actually created by a Buddhist king in Sri Lanka. Because Buddhism as a philosophy and a religion completely equates humans and animals. I mean, what it teaches is that I could be born as a human now and be reborn as some animal later. And according to Buddhism, killing any animal is wrong. So that influence is there. But I think it is not only confined to Buddhism. I think Hinduism has it, Islam has it. The Christianity seems to be a little different. Because there are texts in the Bible which kind of seem to say that humans dominate. But I think it is not only the mainstream religions. I think every community which may not subscribe to some of the mainstream religions all had that worldview.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. And I think that for effective mass education. Otherwise, we cannot internalize the values, environmental values.
Yeah, I think these are values that we need to internalize. And I also think our lifestyles are very disconnected from the natural environment. Because 200-300 years ago, people also knew that their lives depended on the natural environment. Now we can survive without the natural environment with the way we have developed. But if you go to the rural areas, even now in our countries, I think you see this connection. But at the same time, it's also breaking down because these command and control laws, there's another aspect to this. These command and control laws have also broken down the traditional ethics. earlier people knew the forest was theirs and they had to look after it. But now the attitude is, oh, these are government forests. These don't belong to us. It's okay for us to cut them down, to encroach, to poach, to kill animals. That sense of ownership, that sense of dependence on the environment, I think by now has broken down to a very large extent.
You can mention
Absolutely.
any environmental protection movements in Sri Lanka now.
There is. I have to say, we don't have a very, very strong environmental movement. It has become a little fragmented, not like the way India has it and Bangladesh has it, but we do have it. And as I said, it's now, we are very, very concerned, particularly now that development is going in a very destructive way. There has been a lot of illegal development, illegal destruction. We are concerned about the wildlife, people are trying to mobilize, but it also depends on other environments in the country as well.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am. Very good points you have raised. And right now, I would like to know that this corona has changed a lot in not only in human lives but also in environmental cases. So, do you think that whatever we can see that right now, environmental backups are there? Because we are sometimes several regions are also in a backup mode that previous 20 or 10 years back. And we saw in our Indian scenario that the Jamuna River in Delhi, this is completely clear and the sky is completely clear right now, with the visibility range has increased due to the level of decrease of pollution. So do you think that this lockdown situation should be incorporated into the law, environmental law, as that in a month, 2 or 3 days, or 4 days in a month, we should implement this lockdown,
Okay.
complete lockdown?
I'm finding it a little difficult. I think there's something wrong with the computer. What you're asking is during the lockdown, they said the environment really benefited. Yeah, we
Yeah.
saw that too. I mean, we were having like peacocks all over Colombo and deer coming into urban areas and so on. But I'm very pessimistic. I think it is temporary. And
Yes.
we are talking about policies. Policies also depend on the social and political environment in the country. So what kind of policies we are going to implement, it's very complex. And when you talk about ethics and values, you have to depend a lot on the ethics and values of those who will be making those policies. And how much can the rest of us influence those policies, although we may have the ethics and values. So I think it's a very complex thing. So to those of us who are teaching and working in the environmental field, I think this is one of the challenges. Not only to teach, to teach our students, but also create through our teaching people who can influence and,
Absolutely right, ma'am. So now any queries from any participant? Otherwise, we will go for our another speakers. Any queries? So thank you, ma'am. And also we circulate your lecture in our YouTube news channel, that is the Syed Maharshi News. I'll share the link to you. You can also circulate, and there we'll keep it the record also.
yeah.
So thank you. And right now we are going to for another resource person, Dr. Ronnie Chatterjee from Kyoto University, Japan. Sir, am I
Yeah,
audible,
hi,
sir?
Vishwajit. Yes,
Okay,
hi,
hi.
Vishwajit.
So you may please start your presentation with the screen share. Thank you.
Okay,
The platform
thank
is
you.
yours.
Let me share my screen. I hope the slides are visible to everyone.
Yes.
Okay. So a very good evening from Kyoto, Japan. Uh, I was really humbled by while hearing to Professor Gunaratne and the kind of the topic she shared, and something that was very close to what I was also working recently. Uh, but I won't get into that topic as of now. Possibly what I would be focusing on for today's session is something which is right now in very much, I would say, limelight, the micro, small, medium enterprises, and how do they function in disaster management. Uh, this topic is something which has not, I would say, come into highlight in the recent times, but has been there for a very long time. But possibly the COVID-19 pandemic has brought in so many challenges that this somehow earlier was kind of missed out, and the focus used to be mostly on the larger companies. But now, because the common man has started getting affected because of the COVID-19, so the micro, small, and medium scale enterprises is where the focus has shifted from the large enterprises. Uh, this will be the three main kind of topics or subtopics that I would today touch upon. What is MSME? What are the how does Sendai framework of action actually touches on MSMEs? Sendai framework, I'm sure many of you might have heard if you are working in the disaster management sector. Then what are the shortcomings of MSME? How do they react in disaster management? How to engage the MSMEs effectively? So this would be more or less the content of today's presentation. Before I start on MSMEs, I would actually try to bring your focus to what private sector is. And because it's not an interactive lecture, I could have actually preferred an interactive lecture, but let me do the one-way talking. So private sector basically is a part of the economy which is referred to the citizen sector. You know, it is run by private individuals or groups, and mostly it is for profit motive. But then there is also a perspective where NGOs also sometimes are included in the private sector, but that's something which depends on where you are and how you are positioning your perspective. And these private sectors mostly don't come under the direct control of government. And here I put some pictures of, you know, big companies. I'm sure you would recognize from this logos. And here I put some pictures of what we see if you have been to Hong Kong, what you see in India generally. I'm assuming most of the participants are from India, but also in Nepal or Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. This is a very common scene if you are out in the evening. So why I put this picture is to show the contrast that both of them actually make for the private sector. And somehow what I put in the right hand side mostly get missed out when you talk about the private sector. And I'll come to this later on in my presentation. But this is just for your understanding that what makes up for the private sector, the scale of private sector. You are where you talk about Google and also talk about the local vegetable seller in front of sitting on the road, both make up for the private sector. When I come to the MSMEs, the MSMEs, why it is important is because if you look at this graph here, like this figure here, you can see that the bottom of the pyramid is where the MSME lies. And that's actually taking a chunk of whatever the total number of enterprises are made of. So if you look at the top very big ones, the top multinational and large companies, they would actually make up for just 1% of all the companies or enterprises that are there, whereas the MSMEs actually make up for the rest 99%. And this is from IFC's 2010 document. Let's see the landscape of MSMEs or SMEs in Asia. And this shows how the MSMEs landscape of MSMEs in the Asia Pacific, Asia mainly. And you can see that the employment generation by this is really high in certain, like in this is, I guess, MYA's Malaysia, where it is 87.4%, going up all the way up to 87.4%. In INO should be Indonesia, I guess. Yes, Indonesia, it is 97%. I'm again, this is a quiz for all of you to find out how much is it in India or in Bangladesh or Nepal. And also you can see their share of GDP. So that's quite high if you compare it with the large corporates or multinational companies. So they make, the MSMEs make up a chunk of what the employment generation is at the national level, and also they are contributing heavily to the GDP. When I talk about the private sector, I'll just try to focus on what are the different classifications, because this private sector classifications is very important. When I say MSMEs, that is just one way of classifying the private sector, which is based on the capital mostly. It also varies. I'm just talking about the capital because this is how we define in India mostly, but there are other factors which defines an MSME, like labor or possibly the profitability of the company, the revenue it is generating. But and the interesting thing is for MSME or the large companies, if we are like classifying it based on the capital, it keeps on varying from one country to the other. So it's very difficult to actually have a very uniform definition across different countries. So it's very country specific or sometimes region specific. And for India, recently, I'm sure many of you who work in this sector would be aware that there has been a recent change in or amend in the MSME Act, where the numbers have been changed, and now this is the current figures, which how you differentiate a micro cottage, small, medium, and large industry enterprise. The second way of actually classifying private sectors is through the products that they are involved in, and it is like manufacturing, service, wholesale, or retail. The third way of classifying them is the formal and informality of it. So the formal and informal nature of the enterprise is like where the enterprise would register or not register. And mostly the ones which do not register actually do not fall in the radar of the government. And possibly that is very good. You don't have to pay taxes. But that becomes an issue when there is a disaster and there is a restructuring of the financial regulations or financial policies. How do this informality actually benefit, or if it benefits or doesn't benefit the private sector? That will come later on in the presentation. And the fourth way is how they engage in different sectors like agriculture, tourism, textile. So these are the different ways of classifying the private sector. This is just a slide to show how the private sector actually is growing in Asia Pacific. And you can see that compared to all the other regions, Asia Pacific is where the private sector is actually having a huge growth. And also, interestingly, in Asia Pacific, it's the MSMEs who are ruling. So most of the investment that is happening in Asia Pacific is in MSMEs. Okay, so coming to the developing economies, how the disaster impact the economies in the Asia Pacific. And you can see that most of this disaster losses are somehow biased or towards Asia Pacific region. So if you consider Asia plus Oceania, which is the Australian continent, you would see that the disaster occurrence is also higher and the relative loss is also very high from disaster. So possibly this is where the Asia Pacific region is also the hotspot of natural disaster as well as climate change. And that's where the economic losses are very high. How does private sector fare in case of a disaster? And these are from past disasters that have been there. So if I look at Gujarat earthquake of 2001, the private sector, you can see, has been bearing the almost, this is in percentage. So they were almost having 75% or more losses in comparison to the public sector. Or if I talk about Mumbai floods, again, it is around 75%. Uttarakhand floods, again, around 74% possibly. Nepal earthquake, it's again around 75 to 76%. So we can very clearly see that the private sector is always the one who is getting affected in all these disasters. And there has been some one or two conditions where possibly the private sector doesn't get so much impacted. That was one case I would remember is from Odisha, cyclone Philin in 2013. The private sector loss was not very high. And one of the reasons was that this affected mostly the rural areas or possibly the areas which were not very highly industrialized. So somehow the private sector losses were lower in comparison to the public sector. But otherwise, the private sector losses are really high in comparison to the private sector, the public sector. This is an interlinkage of climate change and DRR, how it affects. And you can see that this disaster risk reduction falls somewhere in the center here. And the vulnerabilities, exposure, and weather event climate change. So these all make up for the kind of what do you call cumulative effect. And that's where disaster risk reduction comes in the center. And you must be wondering, like, why is this important? Because this is important because most of this kind of exposure, greenhouse gas emissions, and also natural variability and other factors actually link to the private sector. And I won't get too much into details of this, I guess. Looking at the private sector, so how does private sector get affected in case of a disaster? So if I look at a private small business, I am not talking about the big businesses, but the smaller ones, a disaster would actually affect a household and its assets. And it would actually also affect the livelihood. So livelihood, in the sense, livelihood is actually two types. One, which is income generating, which is business, and then the non-income generating, which is, say, like subsistence farming. So both of them get affected, and these are connected through labor, investments for operational spaces, and also income, wage, rent. So this connection is very important, and disaster has this dual impact on both. And this is very important because it's just not the business which is getting affected, but also the household and this whole kind of circle which is getting affected. So that is a very important aspect while considering why private sector and then why should we focus on MSMEs, because MSMEs are the ones where this cycle is very important because they are very close to their household. And even if I talk about, if the lower you go in the scale, the more it is, this relation is applied, where households run their small businesses from their own houses. And the moment a house is damaged, the whole business is damaged, or the business is damaged, the house is damaged. So it's a vice versa relation that is here. Looking at what kind of impacts businesses have. So there are basically four impacts. So the direct impact, where a disaster might affect physically the assets and the stock or the building where the private sector is operating from. There might be indirect impacts where the business might not have a physical direct impact, or possibly a physical direct impact is there, but also it is affecting the supply chain, client, market, and other things. There might be a wider impact where the government policies actually indirectly affect the private sector. And one of the examples that I remember is from Sri Lanka, where after the 2004 tsunami, the government was doing recovery in the, I guess, in somewhere in the, I forgot the name of the area, but they were doing reconstruction of houses. And in that process, they actually kind of closed, or kind of forcefully closed, all the informal hotel businesses which were there earlier. And that took away the livelihood of a lot of people. So it might not be the direct impact, but it might have an indirect impact. And this all can also have kind of impact on the overall national GDP or the growth rate, as we are currently seeing in COVID-19 pandemic. So these are the 4 different impacts that a business can have from a disaster. Coming to the Sendai framework and the SDGs. So, there are a lot of this, especially 2015 was a very important year where there are 3 main global policies that came out, specifically which are related to disaster management and also private sector. One was Sendai framework of our DRR. The other is Paris Agreement. Then the third is uh, Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. So these 3 actually have a very important component for the private sector. And like for the Sendai framework, the private sector major group was the first, for the first time it was actually included as a major group. Till then, private sector was always at the periphery of disaster management. But slowly it was realized that private sector actually is a very important actor when it comes to disaster management. And I guess Professor Gunaratne also shared a bit on the private sector role in her earlier presentation. I'll just focus on Sendai framework and not go into details of each of the global policies. The Sendai framework, if you are aware of, is the 3rd in the series of world conferences. The first one happened in Yokohama in Japan. The second was in Hyogo in Japan, and the third was Sendai in 2015. I was lucky to be part of it, and I was kind of also part of the private sector deliberations. And what led to this Sendai was mainly the 2011 Thailand floods and the East Japan earthquake in 2011. Both of these events actually had a huge impact on the private sector. And if many of you who are into photography would realize that the prices of Nikon camera suddenly went up after the Thailand floods, or there was a disruption also in Toyota cars in India because what happened in Japan in 2011. So a major impact was on the private sector, which impacted the local and the regional economy. And that's where this realization came in, that private sector needs to be included if we need to reduce the economic losses as a part of the global policy. So that became a background to Sendai. And I'm just trying to list out how the private sector actually these commitments have evolved. If you see in 2008, that was the first time when there are this Asian ministerial conferences, and I'm sure many of you would know. It happened in India in 2016. This year, it was supposed to happen in Brisbane. It got cancelled because of COVID-19. So in 2008, AMCDRR, the private-public partnership was what was focused on. And that point of time, it was the private sector's role was more on funding rather than actually become a kind of a main policy maker or kind of a policy influencer. In 2010, the role of private sector was more focused on climate change and disaster risk reduction, but there was not much of action that was looking for the private sector to bring in. In 12, there was a focus on risk data sharing through PPP, business continuity planning was stressed. In 2014, again, business continuity management, BCP, case studies were shared, collaborations between large and small scale enterprises for developing actionable toolkit was focused. But what changed after 15 is, if you see, promote private sector investment in science and technology, private sector to collaborate for resilient infrastructure. So earlier it was more that private sector should manage for themselves, but now they have become an integral part of the infrastructure development and how resiliency can be created within from like internally rather than looking at private sector as an external actor. So that has been a major change in the global as well as the national policy decisions for private sector. Uh, Two major areas where the private sector actually has a very important role is in reducing disaster losses, economic losses in relation to global gross domestic product. And while I say that, the role of the MSMEs is very important because though we are talking about like in the national level or so say in the regional level, the contribution of the bigger companies might be a lot, but when it comes to the local economy, that's where the local MSMEs play a very important role, and they have a very much important say in the local economy, not only in the economy but also in the initial phases of a disaster, how the life goes back to normal, how you like for an example, say in the COVID-19 situation, especially in India, though I didn't have a chance to visit India during this COVID because of the lockdown, but I'm aware that most of these big grocery shops actually closed operation, and people had to depend on the local grocery stores. So those stores actually would be catering to this micro or small industries, and they were the one who were running the show rather than the big ones, which actually had to close down. So that's how they play it's not only the global economy but also the local economy, which is actually run by the private sector and especially the MSMEs. And the second one is substantial reduce in the critical infrastructure disruption, and also the other healthcare educational facilities like say PPE, mask and other supplies were actually provided by the micro and small scale industries rather than the bigger ones who were into different things. And then you can see that how the bigger companies like like the big brands were actually trying to produce hand sanitizers, actually were trying to produce ventilators, like Volvo was trying to make ventilators and all those things, but they were trying to imitate what the smaller ones do. I'll just skip this slide. Possibly people who are interested can read into it later. SARC also has a very clear role for private sector, and people who are aware of the SARC Disaster Management Center. So way back in, I guess, 2012, they had come up with this policy for engaging the private sector. And there they are talking about BCM plans, how SMEs should work in the region to ensure continuity, building societal resilience through engagement of the private sector, corporate social responsibility, and generate economic and social economic losses, data on economic losses. So these have been realized and have been put into the policy, but the implementation somehow has not been happening in the SAARC region because of differences within the SAARC region member countries, and also possibly due to challenges of how to take it, take it down to the ground and implement it. So coming to the gaps in the global and regional dialogues, the private sector as is focused in the regional global dialogues is like a homogeneous entity where they say private sector should do this, but private sector is not a homogeneous entity, and that I'll tell you how it is from some case studies. It actually needs to differentiate the different you know classifications of the private sector. The second is majority of the commitments in all this global meetings come from the large enterprises, and they look down on the private sector saying that, okay, you should do this. Then there is hardly any voice of the small scale industries that what they need. So when you look down on the from the large enterprises to the smaller ones, they try to enforce rather than create ownership, and that becomes a deterrent for the small industries to take up such global policies. The third is regional and sub-regional national studies are very limited. Establishment of network for sub-regional organizations for data is not focused, and there is hardly any cooperation that is being made for the private sector, especially of the smaller organizations who actually do not maintain data sets, but their operation method would be much more, I would say, ad hoc. So that becomes a challenge for data sharing. All this big data, the big data hype might not actually apply to very small industries who are operating at a local level. The private sector is again stereotyped for public-private partnership rather than actually looking at other strengths that they can bring on board. So that becomes a challenge on how to increase the participation of the private sector. And when I say private sector, it is the MSMEs here. This is just an idea of who operates in the private sector, what is the framework in the regional level. And you can see that a private sector would actually operate with the help of different bilateral organizations, even agencies, also with like regional organizations like ADRNN, ADPC, SDMCs, SAARC Disaster Management Center, AHA Center of ASEAN in Asia region, and they also are linked to member nations in regulation, as well as the civil society organizations and academia. So this basically shows a framework for how the private sector engages in Asia, and then private sector comes somewhere here in the core. But then the private sector is there, but most of it is run by the large companies, but there is hardly any kind of focus on the very small industries or enterprises. And why this small and medium scale enterprises needs to be focused is because the risk is really high. Though the value of loss is low, possibly say a small company, if they get affected by a disaster, the loss data or the loss in financial terms would be very less, which would be much lower to a big company getting affected, because their operations is also big, the investment is big, the revenue is big. But when it comes to the numbers would be really high, and that's where the micro, cottage and small industries and the medium scale industries actually would account for a huge chunk of the loss. And secondly, they don't have any expertise to actually manage this loss, whereas the multinational and large companies would actually have a lot of expertise. Their pockets would be deeper to manage and offset these losses, but the offsetting power of the micro, cottage industries would be really low. Why need to focus on the MSMEs? The reason being the resilience to disaster and climate risk determines from the recovery of the local and national markets. And this local market is run by MSMEs, as I already told you. The local job creation is done by the local economy, by the MSMEs. And if we cannot maintain the social stability at the local level, it will reflect on the national economy as well as the national political stability and other things. So the local action and local stability is very important through the MSMEs. The MSME's resilience is also a critical element for the stability of the global market, because most of these big companies actually take their supplies from the small ones. Like say, for example, a big company like Toyota would actually get their very small spare parts from the MSMEs, and there are certain components which might actually be outsourced from a particular small company. In case that gets affected, the whole supply chain breaks. So for the kind of ensuring that their own supply chain works, the large company has to maintain that the small companies also run in case of any disaster. The role of the MSMEs as innovators. So, most, and this is something I'm sure many of you know, that most of these big companies like car companies, for example, say Suzuki or Honda or even Toyota, actually started as small scale industry, a small scale company from the garage or maybe a small shed, and then they grew big. So, and the moment they go big, they don't innovate on product so much, but they innovate more on the process. The product innovation actually happens when you are small, because you are trying to compete and fight and sustain in the market. So it's basically the survival of the fittest. And for that, the MSMEs become innovators, not possibly by choice as well as by force. And again, this informal economy, I'm sure many of you are working on that, on the migration issues in India and stuff. So they also are relating to the MSMEs, and that's where many of the employment is actually there, and there's hardly any social protection. So that's where we need to bring in the MSME to be, looking at the risk reduction aspects of disaster as well as climate change. Impact of disaster on the private sector. I will not get into details of this one. So where does the business risk lies in the MSME? The business risk actually lies in the business interruption that they have, that the MSMEs have. And this is focused on the high vulnerability to disaster, because most of these MSMEs won't have too much of money to invest in a very safe location. They would actually take up marginal lands, and their risk would be much higher in comparison. So they might be taking up floodplains where to set up their companies. And it's like in Mumbai, I have worked in Mumbai. You can see most of these areas which are industrial zones get flooded or are exposed to different other hazards. They have limited capacity. Like a small industry would have the owner, who would be the manager, who would be the kind of accountant, who would be also contributing as a labor in the industry. And that person won't have too much of expertise to make a business continuity plan, or kind of look into the how to safeguard the business. So that kind of limited capacity, limited hands are there. Gaps in data knowledge and governance. As I said, that informal industries doesn't actually feature in the government records, so they don't know how they, and in case of any disaster, that's when the grappling starts. I remember in Kerala, after the 2018 floods, I was there, and there was a huge, the chief minister actually wanted to focus on the informal sector, but then there was no data. So how do you bring the informal sector loss? So it was more of a consensus data that, okay, possibly they have got this amount of loss, but there is no baseline data. So without any baseline data, how do you say that they are recovering? From where are they recovering? So that's a big gap that is there. And less likely to invest in proactive risk reduction schemes. Say even for the smaller ones, they cannot even afford insurance schemes. They don't invest in insurance schemes. So how do they offset their losses? This is an asset-based framework. This is actually from my own research. One way to assess how the MSME losses happen, and this doesn't follow a general assessment framework which we see for the larger companies, because the problem with the MSMEs is they are much more focused on their, not only on their economic or physical asset, but also they rely a lot on their social, cultural, and natural assets, where in their own small environment where they're there. And unless we take that into consideration, it's very difficult for us to understand how this MSME loss and also the recovery happens. So if you look at this framework, it talks about the pre-disaster losses, and then how a disaster would affect them directly, indirectly, or wider impacts. There would be aids coming in, and how does that help in the business restarting, and then the whole process of recovery. So if you want to understand the whole recovery part of the MSMEs, this is the whole flow that has to be understood to realize that how the recovery happens in different aspects, not only in financial terms or in physical terms. This is from another MSME estimation, risk estimation framework, which we are currently working on. This is like what we say is an MSME as a organization would have their internal risk, which is a component of technology, innovation, human resource, finance, and operation. So these are the internal processes that a business would have. And then there would be also exposure to government regulations. As I already said, that government regulations actually might expose certain businesses to higher risk. Change in markets that would be happening, and that would again fluctuate based on the sector, and exposure to other risks, like what happened in Calcutta or West Bengal, say, for Cyclone Amphan, or what happened to Mumbai, or now what is happening in Assam. So there might be other it might be a multi-hazard risk scenario where other hazards actually might impose or kind of accelerate the impact of any one disaster event, and that all cumulative effect might actually need to be understood for estimating the risk of especially in terms of COVID-19. So this is a model that we are trying to apply for a simulation tool that we are currently developing. I'll take you through one or two cases of Nepal from my PhD days. And this is to show that how the formal and informal nature of businesses actually show a variance in the way businesses recover. So this is in Kathmandu Valley. I was doing my research, and we were I was interacting with the small scale industries in the there are this, if someone is there from Nepal or Kathmandu, would realize Balaju, Patan industrial areas, which are very clustered industrial areas set up by the government. So there we were talking to people, and we are trying to understand what was the impact of the 2015 Nepal earthquake on these businesses. What is how they think that they would recover. And if you see here that most of these businesses said that they would recover within 2 to 3 years of the earthquake. Whereas this informal businesses, which I took like informal, there's a traditional settlement where a lot of people engage in traditional businesses, and also the small scale industries, businesses like groceries and wood carving, metal carving and stuff. So there they don't register with the government mostly. So I was talking to them, and I was trying to understand what do they perceive would the time that they require for recovery. And you can see a stark difference here, where most of this formal businesses actually would recover. They think that they would recover within 4 to 5 years, whereas if you see here, within 4 to 5 years, it would be almost 50% of this informal businesses who said they would recover. And I'm sure this the data size is not very high, but if we look at it with a bigger sample, still it would correlate to these findings. And the reason being, and the implication of policy is, if you look at most of the recovery policies, they stretch for like 5 years. But if you see here, the informal businesses actually won't recover within the 5 years if the current situations when I was doing this study could have continued. So it's just, and then consider there would be other stressors, like after when I was doing this study, there was Nepal block, the Indian put a border blockade for Nepal, and the things became much more difficult for them to recover because the supplies were cut off. So there are these continuous stressors which actually put more pressure on the recovery. So this whole timeline is very important while we are deciding on the how the recovery actually should happen for the private sector, or especially the MSMEs. Again, this is an example from these two areas where I was doing my research. And if you see here, there is a trend where the informal industries, you will see that they would actually uh, kind of restart businesses which has importance for a disaster, like say bottled water, which is immediately required after a disaster, or say bakeries which would supply food. Whereas in the informal industry, you would see that the groceries and the cold storage, which actually supply food, are the ones which would start immediately. So the disruption time is much lesser for them. Whereas say for electric stores or wood carving, they would actually take much more time to restart, because that their business is not getting impacted immediately. So it's actually taking advantage of the market, changing market, and the demand that the market is giving coming out after the disaster. So how different sectors actually also change, or the kind of trend that they show after the disaster. This is a good example for that. Okay, so coming to the last part of it, where are the gaps in building resilience of the MSMEs? And this actually I am focusing on this part from my recent interaction with UNDRR MSME resilience. That we had a kind of a consultation meeting in Bangkok, and three major areas came out. One is the data gap, the second is the knowledge gap, and the third is the approaches and tools. So these are the three main heads that came out in the discussion, and I would like to share from what has been the problems in each of them. So in the data gap, the was discussed is that there is a need for common database and terminologies. As I shared that, the MSME definition actually varies, keeps on varying from one country to the other. So it's very difficult to generalize on this. The second is the create an incentive for sharing data. There is right now no incentive for the small scale industries to do it. So they operate on their own. The need for pre, during, and post disaster data. And as I said, that most of this in small industries actually don't maintain such data, or they do not share such data on the in the public. So it's very difficult to get hold of those data. Business needs to see the value of investing in resilience. For the small businesses, they don't possibly are not aware of why they should invest, or possibly they don't have that capacity to invest. And basic analysis actually might already be enough to trigger decision making. So while a lot of people are actually promoting BCP as the means, but possibly that's not a very kind of efficient way or effective for the small scale industries who might not be kind of making best use of the BCPs. In terms of knowledge gap, there is the problem of access to recovery mechanisms. Not many industries know how to recover. So they might be doing based on what they feel is right. And one of the example I'll give you from Nepal is what I saw on ground. Like the small businesses, especially in the informal businesses, what they do is they have a copycat principle, where they see that my next door shop was selling grocery and now has started also selling wood carving. So possibly their income has gone up, so profit margin is going up. I should also do the same. So, and by doing that, the next shop also follows this, and this is called copycat principle, where people keep copying the other person, seeing the success, and then what happens in the whole area, you will have everyone doing the same. So the monopoly of the business is gone. That's one. The second is, a lot of people actually also try to venture into new areas, and that is a risky business, because you don't know that possible area. So the chance of failure is high. And that's why many of the businesses actually restart and then they fail. Most of the businesses restart and they fail. It's not that a disaster actually brings a complete halt or complete disruption to the business. Most of the businesses restart after the disaster with a hope, and then they fail. Access to tool, data, information. Most of the small industries or small scale industries actually have no understanding of access to tools, understanding of tools, data or information to make decisions, understanding of necessity of undertaking risk and vulnerability. So that part again is missing, because most of them operate on daily basis. It's a rolling money that they need. So they are hardly looking into the risk and vulnerability part, or possibly they don't have that expertise or feasibility within the financial domain to do that. Resource availability to undertake work, like say big data age and all those things I was talking about, and engagement methodology. So they are very small, so they don't know how to actually, how can we contribute, what can we contribute. So that engagement methodology is not very clear. And approaches and tools. So MSME is in policy instead of private sector. So there needs to be this focus on MSME rather than private sector, so that we can focus more on the concerns of MSMEs, how they can come up with, say, for example, a small scale business which is not registered would hardly try to avail the benefits of loan restructuring or financial restructuring, because they don't have, they actually don't have enough documents to show it to the banks. Or in many cases, like in Nepal, after the earthquake, there was a kind of the government was giving loans at lower rate with a mortgage, but then these businesses do not have anything to mortgage, so they don't have access to loans. So what are those evidences that can be brought into the policy is very important, and for that we need to focus more on this as a small scale industry. Then there is a need for strong business case for the private sector to involve. So what is the incentive for the private sector to involve? That is not very clear. And third is, what are the tools which can be utilized by the private sector? So those are also not very clear as of now. Having said that, I don't know how many of you are aware of the Arise platform. The Arise platform is a, UN supported, UNDRR supported platform which involves the private sector to work on their resiliency, to promote disaster risk reduction. As of now in Asia, there are 3 Arise members. India is one of them, Arise India, which is housed in Fiki. The other 2 are in Arise Japan and Arise Philippines. So these are the 3 Arise members as of now. And also from India, Anand Mahindra is the current member for Arise, board member for Arise. Earlier, HCC, Hindustan Construction Company, was a member for Arise. So there has been a considerable amount of uh, awareness generation happening, but again, not coming down to the MSMEs. And we are engaged with the Arise initiative in India to see that how more MSMEs can be brought into it. And recently I was involved also in sending kind of creating a guidelines for the informal sector recovery, which was sent to the Prime Minister and the Ministry of MSME, so that could be taken up for how to recover the informal sector post the this COVID pandemic, because it would go on for a much longer period than just if the vaccine is developed, still the recovery would take a bit more time. So in summary, the MSMEs are at higher risk within the private sector. There are issues of data gaps, knowledge gaps, and tools. And there is a need for new approaches for the risk estimation and management of MSMEs. With that, I end my session today. And if you have anything, you can contact me here. And of course, the floor is open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chatterjee, for your wonderful lectures on the MSMEs related issues. And right now, the platform is for the audience. If any audience have any queries, please ask. Uh, Dr. Chatterjee, can you just minimize your, stop your screen share? That
Yeah,
we can,
sure.
yes. I saw quite clear from your presentation. It's very, really very interesting and innovative. And in case of MSMEs and all that, you are wants to start in that particular field. I would like to know one thing. We know that government of India has till now provided lots of opportunities for MSMEs and startups. So if a student in a college or university level, they wants to start and disaster related issues, converted in them into the MSME part. So how they can initiate? What is your suggestion?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that question. In fact, we are working on this aspect. For me, I work on MSMEs, but I realize that unless I kind of go into the mud, I won't realize how deep is the mud. So I also started a small startup, which is a social enterprise. And we try to understand that what exactly this sector is, how it is functioning. And one of the initiative that we started as a part of the social enterprise is with the different IITs and NITs as of now, and also with few other universities outside India, where we are trying to promote thematic incubation. So like most of this, the idea for any disaster based startup is that it's a niche market. People would actually look at product which would come in handy when there is a flood, like you would be building a very nice jacket or something, but that's not true. It's something which is part of your daily life and which can actually come in handy. So this is a concept that we are trying to promote, and at this point we are working with a few IITs, few NITs, and also some private organizations and universities, and also we are working with the government of India, also with some UN agencies to promote this. This has also featured as an innovative approach for disaster risk reduction in higher education. And I would suggest that if people actually want to venture into disaster management, young students, they should do it, and they should consider that they can actually write to me if they are interested. We can actually involve them. We are currently doing also a hackathon right now on social innovation, and that's a bilateral hackathon between India and Japan, where we are trying to promote uh, this small businesses or young entrepreneurs who can come in. That's one. The other platform that we have started is an association of disaster risk management professionals. Right now, there is I'm an architect by training. So as an architect, after I graduate, I can become a part of the Indian Association of Architects or Council of Architects, which is actually under the parliament. But for disaster management, I think it's a very open field. Everyone can come in and say, I'm a disaster manager. So that is good. Everyone is a disaster manager. But then there are around 35 universities who are running courses now in disaster management. So what happens to the students who are taking up disaster management courses? If they are taking it up as a career, then there has to be a line where you differentiate that, okay. And that's how any other religion, any other kind of education system also is doing, right? Any other discipline is. If you are a geographer, you would be part of the geographers association. architect don't get into a geography association. But then why is that disaster management would have everyone and then it has no specialization? So there is a need for this
Yes.
disaster management to become a career, and that
Mm.
unless it becomes a career, the young people will always go for MBA, they will go for other professions where they see a career opportunity. But disaster management is like, okay, there is Ampha, then we'll go in. But that's not actually the problem with disaster management. It's a
Absolutely.
part of your daily life. So I think these are the two things that I would advise for the young students to come up and take notice of.
So it's a very good point you have raised that disaster employment can be part of that entrepreneurship also. So in that case, in future we are planning to also collaborate with your organization for collecting this knowledge and sharing this knowledge to the university level,
Mhm.
as we have already corrected. And still now, uh, in case of disaster education, whatever the universities have conducted in their through their courses.
Mhm.
So yesterday we know that our education policy has changed,
Right.
and this education policy has quite dynamic become the prepared this education policy in a quite dynamic mode, which basically helps to promote our students and thinking their knowledge pattern into the more entrepreneurship way, and it's a very good sign. So if any students want to work with your institution, suppose I want to work with your institution, how we should start, how we should initiate our approach.
Okay. So there is two ways of doing it. I will actually come to your first question. I think there were two questions in your
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right. The first part, as I said, there are 35 institutions who are running disaster management courses in India. I happen to graduate from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, which is a very well established institute,
Yes, yeah.
TIS Mumbai, and I was the second batch of disaster management student to take up disaster management when people actually didn't know what disaster management is. And I left my architecture job. I used to work for a big multinational company. I took up disaster management, and then my
Congratulations.
parents actually got worried that, are you going to cut trees and go into all these areas where people don't go in? I said, yeah, that is what I like doing. But the problem lies somewhere else. Like Tata Institute is more focused on the social science perspective of disaster management. IIT Roorkee has a course on disaster management, but they are more technically oriented.
Hmm.
And then some other courses are, so we recently last year we did a study on Indian universities who are running disaster management courses, and one of the finding is none of these courses have a minimum benchmarking for what they are running. So we are trying to work on that and trying to create a benchmark for all the universities to have a minimum standard on what they are teaching in disaster management. That's one. Coming to your second question, uh, what we can do is possibly, if you go to our site, which is RICA India, you could see there is a tab, Seeds of Innovation. And if anyone is interested, they can actually put in their idea. We work on science, technology, and innovation, and we promote local innovation. We don't work on global innovation because global innovation doesn't actually exist. It's always local innovation, which can be scaled up possibly if it, at all can be. So if they have some very bright ideas, they can share their ideas and they can come in and actually develop that idea as an intern with our organization, and we can provide all kind of support for that.
Thank you, Dr. Chatterjee, for sharing your valuable lecture on the very important topic, as well as also discuss several issues related to the disaster management, how it can be a part of our employment and bread and butter also. So
Yep.
very good. And thank you once again to all the participants for joining with us. Tomorrow we have our last day of this faculty development program, and there will be two speakers from Kenya and also from Germany. So we will join with the same link. And thank you once again. And I will communicate with you definitely on behalf of Syed to collaborate for that
Sure,
particular
sure.
aspect. So with this, thank you, sir. Namaskar.
Thank you. Namaskar.